Good morning and welcome to Community Conversations. I'm Vicki Green. I'm so excited to have today's guest in studio to talk about something political, but wait, it has nothing to do with the current race and everything to do with the 100th anniversary of a woman's right to vote. And if you're listening and you're not a woman, it doesn't matter. It's men and women that need to care about this, in my opinion. And we're going to tell you why. Just in my research, I realized how much I didn't know about what women went through to get the right to vote. And fast forward to today, women are now running for local, state, regional, and national office. So I do want to stress, it's critical in my opinion, that this is important for men and women listening, because it takes men to raise strong women or support strong women in all areas of their lives. So that said, I won't keep you waiting any longer to introduce you to my guest today, who is Freddie Kay, a retired attorney, founder and president of the Women's Suffrage Celebration Coalition of Massachusetts. One more time. Women's Suffrage Celebration Coalition of Massachusetts. I'm going to call it WCC, but suffrage is the key word. Thank you very much for being here this morning, Freddie. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, you're a retired lawyer. You've been involved in many women's rights organizations, campaigns. However, the Suffrage Celebration Coalition is nonpartisan, correct? Okay, and that's important. Now, you moved to Massachusetts to go to graduate school and stayed. I grew up here, but I didn't know half of what this state played, the role this state played in women's right to vote, and suffrage is the word we use. So yes, folks, we're going to go back in time with regard to a woman's right to vote and the question of how far have we come in voter participation of women. And hopefully everybody listening will ask themselves, how far have we come by the end of this discussion? So Freddie, you started this organization in 2010. So with about 18 organizations backing you, which to me is a lot. Why'd you start it?
It was started because it was the 90th anniversary of women getting the vote. And actually, Martha Coakley, who's a friend and colleague, gave me a call and said, Freddie, you know, the 90th anniversary is coming up. Do you want to do anything? And I was thrilled with the question and said, yes, absolutely. And I had an idea of exactly what I wanted to do. And I'm happy to share that with your audience. It was a movie that I had seen a few years before called Iron Jawed Angels, starring Hilary Swank. It's an HBO movie. It's available in many libraries on DVD.
What's the name of it again?
Iron Jawed Angels, starring Hilary Swank. That may be a way to find it. It's also on YouTube to find it that way. It's an incredible movie, and it is about history that most of us don't know. So when you talk about looking into this and saying, I didn't know this, that's true for most of us because we were not taught this history, and it's unbelievable history. So I look at the 90th anniversary, which was in 2010, and the upcoming anniversary in 2020, which is the centennial, the 100th anniversary, as enormous opportunities for people to learn about this incredible history that was just not included in our history books.
So do you think it needs to be added more to the curriculum? There needs to be more focus in today's curriculum?
Absolutely. It was huge when women actually got the vote. That meant half of the population was then added to the voting ranks. I mean, the change in society, this is just enormous, but it took, some date at 72 years, often you could talk about it as 80 years from the first time people started talking about getting the vote, back in the 1800s with the Grimke sisters, and then Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Some data from 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention.
And we're going to get to that because the big national convention, right, was in Worcester, right where our studios are. The first national women's convention, national, because Seneca Falls happened 2 years prior, but it was more local. Now you have a big event. Well, let's go back for a minute. 2019 was the 100th anniversary of congressional approval, and in Massachusetts they approved it as well, right? However, for the 19th Amendment, so we should say the 19th Amendment, for those of people that don't know, is the women's right to vote. So, but we want to say that it was not ratified by Congress until 1920.
It wasn't ratified by the states, by a sufficient numbers of states.
Oh, that's right. So Tennessee was the 36th state, and that they were the last one. We needed them.
Correct.
Where did Massachusetts fall?
8. We were the eighth state. But the history that precedes, so June 4th was the date that Congress adopted it. It was signed into law, but it had to be ratified by the states, by 3/4 of the states, according to the Constitution. What was amazing was it was ratified. It was passed by Congress on June 4th. By June 25th, only 21 days later, Massachusetts was the 8th state to ratify,
allowing women the right to vote.
But that meant, but women didn't get the vote by ratifying it. It needed all 36 states in order for women to get the vote. If your individual state had adopted the right to vote, then women were voting there. But Massachusetts had not. And one of the surprising things, I think, is even though it was the 8th state to ratify, which sounds like, oh, great, Massachusetts was on board. Well, they were by then, but the history preceding that and the effort to get the vote. So here's a piece of history that I think most people don't know about. And I'll do a comparison of numbers here for marches. So in January 2017, the March for Women,
couple years ago,
the Women's March, in Boston, on Boston Common, there were about 175,000 people who marched, an enormous crowd, right? In 1914 and 1915, when there was an enormous effort to get the vote in Massachusetts, because there were efforts going on state by state by state to get your state to adopt it, there was a parade in Massachusetts in Boston in 1914 and another one in 1915. I'll give the numbers for the bigger one first. In 1915, there were 500,000 people.
Marching in Boston?
Spectators in Boston and
my
15,000 marchers.
That sounds like the March on Washington that they did.
500,000 people. Wow. And it was called the Victory Parade, but unfortunately, 1 month later, which was when it was voted on, it was defeated at the ballot box. After that,
in Massachusetts?
In Massachusetts. So Massachusetts tried to pass it.
But in 1919?
But by 1919, but the other thing I'll say is 1915, Massachusetts tried and failed. New York tried and failed in 1915. New York tried again in 1917, and it was passed. And that was one of the first states east of the Mississippi, because prior to 1900, where there were these efforts going on state by state by state, the only states that were adopting it were in the West.
I saw that. So the other thing, too, is when you say state by state, does that mean that women could vote in those states?
Correct.
In state elections?
Correct.
Okay. So Massachusetts in 1919 could start voting in local.
Well, that was separate.
Okay.
So that was because in some areas of the state, the local communities had given women, not given, because women always had to fight for it. Nothing was offered. So they had to fight for the right to vote, and often it was agreed to that they could vote. Usually it started with school committee, and the reason for that...
Yeah, we talked about this before the show. I said, of all things, is it because they're mothers, so they felt like, okay, you're a mother, female, you should be able to vote because your kids are in the school, so we'll let you vote for school committee, but nothing else?
So it is related to that, because one of the major pieces that when women got the right to vote that was changing the society was this issue of spheres, that men were in the domain of the public sphere. They could speak in public back to the 1800s when women were not allowed to speak in public, particularly in a mixed audience of men and women.
Look at the difference now.
Right?
Oh, goodness.
So, and it was a public sphere, and women's role was to be in the home sphere. So, and there was all this concern about if they voted, they would be coming into this men's world, which was considered not, that was more corrupt, and there were concerns about that. But because voting for school committee was related to the home sphere of children.
Oh, so I'm right then. There we go.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, that made sense to me. So the big year that it was President Woodrow Wilson got behind this, and I've read different reasons why he got behind this, but 1920...
Wait. Woodrow Wilson came to this kicking and screaming, I have to say. So he fought it. He was there were years.
But wasn't he the first president that said, I could be wrong, but wasn't he he was president at the time and was the one that signed off on it?
He did ultimately, but for years. One of the reasons, so it started in 1913. This is very important. In 1913, Woodrow Wilson is inaugurated as the president. At the time, that inauguration took place in March. One of the most important things that's happened in our history that we don't know about is March 3rd, 1913. Alice Paul, a name most of us never grew up with.
I didn't.
Alice Paul, and I would love to talk about her history, she came up with the idea that we need a parade in Washington. Why? People have been at this effort for decades and we're not getting anywhere. She was an American woman who had spent time in England with what in England was called the suffragette movement, and they were the suffragettes. They were more violent. There were also suffragists, ISTS, in England, but the subgroup was literally blowing up buildings. And
The women were
The women were.
blowing up buildings.
And
because all I read about, to be honest, was some of the press that covered the Worcester Convention in 1850 were saying people like Abby Kelly Foster they were using terms like she was fierce and she was using fierce language but they weren't blowing up buildings.
Correct.
I did not know that. That is unbelievable. So you have a big event planned for Tuesday, which is June 25th, at Faneuil Hall in Boston. But there's going to be events with some of your partner organizations. You started with 18, now you have 80.
Over 80.
Wow.
Over 80.
So over 80 organizations. So where...
And they're
so the
on our
big event
website.
They're on the website, which we will put up on our station website. It's suffrage100ma.org. But what are some of the things for the kickoff and the things that my listeners can look forward throughout the year?
So the biggest thing is this kickoff, which is really important because it's our way of announcing to Massachusetts, really, to say, hello, world, this suffrage centennial is coming up. It's a really big deal. And like we were talking about, so many people don't know anything about it. So this is an opportunity to sort of get everybody's attention and say this is really important, and we want people to learn about the history and celebrate it. And then leading up to August 26th, 2020, which will be the 100th anniversary. So Massachusetts, despite having defeated it by state initially in 1915, luckily turned around and in 1919, June 25th, the date of this event, turned around and passed it so that we ratified the amendment, and then it took until the following August.
I wonder how many women, I don't know if I'm throwing this out there, you may not know. How many women actually used their right? Was it a big group of women?
Back then?
Yeah.
So
the first time they could vote.
Well, what's really interesting about it was the vote was obtained. Congress adopted the amendment in June. Prior to June, back in February, I believe it was in 1919, there were suffragists, Carrie Chapman Catt and others, who recognized that many women would be concerned, nervous. They might
That's what I'm thinking.
Right, to
They
go
don't wanna
vote. And so those suffragists turned an organization. They were running into the League of Women Voters.
Oh, which many people may know. It's in almost every city
Right.
and town. You have a League of Women Voters they hold events and
So they were
candidate nights.
right.
Wow.
They were suffragists
But it
who
reminds me-
recognized.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you, but it reminds me too of something we were talking about before. Is I can't help but think about civil rights at the same
Yes.
time, because it was just as much a fight, and we do see a lot of movies, thank goodness, and there is a lot of talk. Finally, at least talk and good conversation about civil rights and equality there. But I didn't know about the women's right to vote as such a big fight.
There was
civil
a
rights.
huge fight.
Yeah, and so there's going to be a lot of activities going on throughout the year.
But
Yep, go ahead.
There are two things that I'd like to point out. One of the
Okay.
things that's really interesting is that a lot of the suffrage movement grew out from people, starting with the Grimke sisters, who were here in Massachusetts, who were abolitionists.
Were they on the North Shore?
They were in the Boston area. They were all over. They were traveling and speaking, which was very unusual. And William Lloyd Garrison, they were working with him. So what was happening is Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, many others were abolitionists who also were recognized.
Meaning they're anti-slavery.
Correct. So, for instance, they were learning that they didn't have rights as women, that they were fighting for others. So part of
Meaning
this,
they were fighting to end the slave movement.
Correct.
And at the same time realizing, well, wait a minute, I can't vote.
Well, here a great example was Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, Lucretia Mott of Nantucket, I'm a Quaker, went to the World Anti-Slavery Convention in 18...
There was one?
Yes, in London in 1840.
Oh, in London.
In London in 1840. And that's when the two of them met. And one of the reasons they met is because they learned when they arrived that the women couldn't vote in the World Anti-Slavery Convention. And they were, as women, that was the issue. And William Lloyd Garrison was so upset about that. He agreed with them that that was horrible, and he forfeited his vote and sat with them in the women's section.
Boy, does that sound like parallels of today.
Yes.
And that's what's amazing. So we talked about the Worcester Convention in 1850, 170 years ago. There were approximately 1,000 delegates from 11 states, men and women, and that includes people like Susan B. Anthony. And if you're from Central Mass and Massachusetts, you've heard of Abby Kelly. Abby Kelly Foster, there's a charter school named after her. She's a big name, especially here in the city of Worcester and surrounding towns. But there are also men, like you mentioned, William Lloyd Garrison, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Bronson Alcott, Louisa May Alcott's father. But they were mocked by
and
the
Frederick
press.
Douglass.
And Frederick Douglass. And then again, that's got that the anti-abolitionists and it's a crossing section of the what I call early civil rights, because I think of that. So it took another 7 years for the amendment, as you said, to come to fruition. There were marches and things like that. But I love pop quizzes, and I found one that is on what was the YWCA in Boston, but it's on ywboston.org, which is their new website. And you and I were talking about this, and I'm going to, you know the answer to this one. You were afraid you weren't going to know. And I did give you the questions ahead of time, but you already knew before I answered. So the first question, which state was the first state in which women could vote?
Montana.
No.
Not Wyoming.
No,
I'm
you
sorry.
were thinking of question 2. I'll give you that. Wyoming. But not for the reason people think, right?
Correct.
Why?
So, well, we've learned that in that those states which had many more men living there and not enough women, and they were trying to attract women to come move out west. So the women wanted the vote, and the men felt like, oh, you want that? We'll give you the vote. Let's get the vote, and
come on, women, come out free. You can vote. Come move to Wyoming.
Exactly.
It was like a 6-to-1 ratio of men to women. So it reminds me now of some of the things that I don't know, maybe in the last couple of years, but maybe 10 years ago, the big thing was move to Alaska. Yeah.
I will say, I know it's not the only reason, because the women who were already living there, they were working hard, and the men recognized that they were working side by side with them in the fields in Wyoming. And so it was the spheres, like we talked about earlier, men's spheres and women's spheres, the spheres out in the West, I think were much more blurred because everybody had to work together to make it work.
Well, isn't that what I read? And it might have, I thought it was why one of the reasons in this, and it was from some of the data that I found yesterday when I was looking at something about Woodrow Wilson, is that one of the reasons they're saying that he came around was because, and a lot of men in the U.S. came around, was because of when women stepped up in World War I to take care of when the men went to war. Now, I don't know if this is the way they positioned it for him or not, but I mean, we do know that women stepped up in both World Wars when the men were fighting, and I had read that Woodrow Wilson and other men. So you're smiling. You're saying, no, that may not. You may have read that, but that's not the case.
Well, I think what's important to know is that even at the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson was still not doing everything he could to make this happen. One of the ways we know that, and there are 2 things I just want to be sure to mention. Because there was no progress being made, or very little progress, I should say, Alice Paul, this woman who created this enormous parade, I started to talk about it March 3rd, 1913.
In Boston?
No, this was in Washington when Woodrow Wilson arrived at the train station and Union Station in Washington and said, "Where is everybody?" And they said, "Oh, they're at the Women's March." And Alice Paul put together the first parade for women. There were thousands of people there, thousands. And it was the first time women had come to march for the right to vote. Interestingly, that's where there's also the story of Ida B. Wells, a spectacular African-American woman who
From where?
Illinois. And she wanted to march in the parade for women to get the right to vote. And this was where the tension comes up, and Alice Paul and the group
Even
that was
among women? Saying we don't know if we want women of color
because they were worried about the southern states, and they needed the support of the southern states, and they knew that the southern states didn't want integration. So Ida B. Wells, to her credit, was told that she needed to walk with the other African American women in the back of the parade.
So they were walking.
They were walking. They were in the. She defied that and just walked right in.
So the early Rosa Parks. There we go.
She was amazing. The other thing that I wanted to link that to was that was the parade in 1913 when Woodrow Wilson came back from Europe for his discussions at the end of World War I. He almost went to New York, but I understand he didn't go. He heard there were going to be huge demonstrations by the women, so he came to Boston. But Alice Paul came up from Washington, and by that point, the National Women's Party was formed here. And I'm thinking about all the history. We haven't talked about Lucy Stone, and
I know you're so passionate about it. The bottom line is, we could do 3 hours on the history of this. So we need. I'm sure. I know it's probably mentioned in the textbooks, and I didn't look at. I don't know what the curriculum is in the books that are currently being used in elementary, middle school, high school. But more needs to be done. So another question that was interesting was, and this goes a little bit beyond voting rights, but I just thought it was interesting. It was in the same pop quiz on the YWCA's website. When and where was the first law passed that permitted married women to own property in their own name? And that was a southern state.
Yes.
Mississippi. Because it was documented that they voted in favor of that so men could put their property in their wives' names to protect their assets from creditors. And again, I read this and I chuckle because, although it's serious, it's kind of like a nervous laughter because that's exactly paralleling a lot of the things that happened today. So it makes me think, how far have we come? So that was just some fun trivia, but we know that women have been making history. As elected officials on the local level, we're going to go from 1920 to now.
But I want to get
you got to get one more in there? Go ahead.
I do. Two things.
Okay.
January 1917, without having made progress that they wanted, as much progress as they wanted, the Alice Paul also came up with an idea that had never been done before by anyone, which was to picket the White House.
No one had ever picketed the White House before 1917?
Not standing in front of the White House. And they were called Silent Sentinels. They stood out with these incredible signs because at that point Woodrow Wilson was involved in World War I. The war was going on. And a lot of it he would be talking about democracy and how we want to bring democracy to other parts of the world and make sure that it's secure. And their signs talked about how, well, you want democracy in the rest of the world, but at home, half of the population is denied the vote. So they were there for 2.5 years.
They picketed for 2.5 years?
2.5 years, January 1917. And
nobody got arrested?
Oh, yes.
Oh, I was going to say, like today, they would be. Yeah.
Well, they were arrested. The Night of Terror was a big one in November. And I want to make sure that we note Camilla Whitcomb from Worcester was among those who was arrested. The Night of Terror, they were sent to the Occoquan jail. It was horrible.
For picketing in Washington?
For picketing, and then they went to the jail. They were horribly mistreated. The jail was horrific. There were worms in there. It was awful. It was awful. And Alice Paul and Lucy Stone, eventually they would run hunger strikes. And the government figured out they didn't want these women to die and be martyrs, so they force-fed them. Which was
in jail?
In jail. Which meant they were tied down and held down. It took 4 or 5 people. It was horrible, with tubes down their noses. It was really, really bad. And Alice Paul and Lucy Stone had survived this in England, so they knew how to deal with it. But they were damaged for life in some cases. So that
all
was
for the right to vote.
All for the right to vote.
Again, bring it back to that.
So that was January 1917 through June 4th when Congress finally passed it because Woodrow Wilson had not. And in between, backing up to February 1919, when Woodrow Wilson came to Boston, there were women who protested Woodrow Wilson in Boston and were jailed for the vote and held at the Charles Street jail.
Had we in Massachusetts had passed it by that time or no?
No, because we had defeated it in 1915. Now we're waiting for Congress. They gave up on the state by state for Massachusetts. It had been defeated after that enormous parade, and now the effort was focused on Woodrow Wilson and getting him to push Congress to adopt the 19th Amendment.
Which eventually, obviously.
So a few months later, it finally happened.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. So
Sorry.
I want to. No. You're passionate about it, and believe me, with all the information that I didn't know, and I'm a history buff and a presidential buff and politics buff, and this is just incredible for me to learn these things, and that's why I love doing this show, and I hope our listeners appreciate the fact that they're learning something, hopefully,
Hopefully,
about
yes.
this. So devil's advocate, let's talk about today. Women in voting, women in running. Should women during the inaugural speech that they did for Trump this year have, in your opinion, should they have dressed in white as a group to call attention to the fact that they were there and they were women? Or does that defeat the idea of we're equal, we're here?
I don't think it defeats. I think the reason for the white is, number one, to honor the suffragists and the women who worked for decades. We're talking almost 80 years just to get the right to vote. Taxation without representation, and to apply that theory to why women needed the vote. It was just horrible. And Frederick Douglass understood that, and he helped Elizabeth Cady Stanton convince the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. They weren't sure, even the feminists, you would call them today, who believed in women's rights, they were worried that asking for the vote might be too much.
But I draw a parallel with civil rights. I mean, it's almost like Rosa Parks stood up, sat at the back of the
Yes.
bus, but then there were still people saying, I don't think we should go into that cafeteria. We're not allowed in there. Let's just go over to the black section because I don't want to cause any trouble. It's almost like a little bit of the same. But I do want to talk about today. So another role, because I do have my own feelings about that. But devil's advocate on one more. What about the racial divide, and how does one fight? And this is getting to civil rights. So we have fights going on of identities of all kinds, whether it's gender, racial, sexuality, because in history it was anti-slavery at the same time as we talked about. A lot of these abolitionists were fighting for women's rights at the same time, and then realizing, wait, I'm fighting for slavery, I should be fighting for myself as well. So how does that have any, does it bear anything for today, what's going on today? To look back at history and say?
Sure. I think what's really important is we know there were many, many women like Ida B. Wells, Sojourner Truth. It's a very long list of women, including, I'm just...
no, it's okay. So
there were so many.
Abby Kelly.
But I'm thinking about African-American women in Boston as well, who were working so hard for the vote. And what was so unfortunate is unfortunately they had to work separately. But we need to recognize and honor all those women. And so many are up on our website. I hope people will go check that out.
When I saw Nantucket, Framingham, I have a list somewhere. But there's
and also the African-American women and so forth is really important to the movement. So we want to honor them as well. And also, we want to make sure that this movement is frankly intersectional. That this is about voting, and our hope is that people will learn this incredible history of what it took to get the vote, for women to get the vote, for decades. This civil rights movement, if you will, for the vote, that people will appreciate and exercise their right to vote.
And we have an election
in greater
coming up,
numbers,
right?
And I'm talking about everybody, all groups, because the women weren't the only groups. Native American women had limitations on their voting. Asian women had limitations, and not just women, men as well, Native American men. So many, many groups have dealt with many things. And we know that finally the Voting Rights Act was adopted in 1965, which helped tremendously in the southern states who were experiencing Jim Crow, but we also know that today many of those are under battle. We need to fight for those continuing access to the ballot is a continuing issue for everybody, and we need to be involved in
So
that.
when you say access to the ballot, we talk about another big goal of the organization that you belong to as we wrap up is voter participation. So when you say access to vote, do you mean that, yes, they have the right, they need to now more participate in bigger numbers?
So there's both. So I think increased voter participation would be spectacular. It's something we do hope if people learn
Don't
this.
we do that well in Massachusetts?
Well, Massachusetts is definitely better than the rest of the country, but we have room to improve, and more people could definitely get out to vote. Our voting rates compared to much of the rest of the world are very, very low. And the other piece is where voting rights are under siege, where the government in many cases are making it difficult for people to vote, making it really hard. That's horrible, and we all need to be vigilant about access to voting.
Okay, so the WSCC, and let's hope I can get this right. Again, it's the Women's Suffragette Celebration Coalition.
Women's Suffrage Celebration Coalition.
Women's Suffrage Celebration Coalition, WSCC. Suffrage100ma.org. And again, that website will be up on our website. If you want to volunteer, donate, maybe a group you're working with is participating in an event for this big upcoming centennial. But I hope, again, that everyone listened, learned just at least one thing. And I hope that everyone, male, female, parent, grandparent, uncle, brother, will keep the conversation going about the right to vote, especially for women. And I'm also going to talk about equality in general and gender equality and racial. Get out, no matter what race you are, no matter what gender you are, and vote. So thank you today to my guest, Freddie Kay, founder and president of the Massachusetts Suffrage Celebration Coalition.
Thank you so much.
It was wonderful. I learned a lot. That's Community Conversations. I'm Vicki Green. Have a wonderful day.